Next, we'll go to market share and viruses. This is the funniest thing that I love to read here and see, is that, well, OS X and Linux don't get viruses because of their market shares is so small. Well, I'll just counter that with an equally annoying statement and saying, well, if that's the case, then OS X and Linux don't get their share of viruses per their market share. So if Mac OS X owns 5% of the market share, they certainly aren't getting 5% of the market share's viruses. Ditto for Linux. But anyway, putting that aside, why is it that Windows simply gets more viruses than Unix or Linux? Because Unix has certainly been around for a hell of a long time. The BSD codes have been open. I mean, the kernels are open. OS X's kernel is open. It's all there for the world to see. And BSD has been around for quite a while. More than enough time to go at it. And before I go into that, before OS X, Apple had, what, OS 7, OS 8, and OS 9. And they had, at least to my knowledge, less users than OS X has. And they had their fair share of viruses back then. So we moved to OS X and the whole argument of OS X being virtually virus-free. Well, no, I know that there are worms that exist. To basically list a few, like the Oompa Loompa and the Ictana. I think one was an iChat breach, and the other was like a Bluetooth breach. They didn't really get very far, and many of the worms and viruses, and this is what I'm going to get into, especially within the Unix structure, has to function differently. A lot of it rides on file permissions, and if the file permissions simply aren't there, the worm has to do something else, or it doesn't get simply as far. And a great example of this is using the market share scenario. Apache is an extremely popular web server versus IIS. Apache gets its share of attempt attacks. Whether they're successful is another story, but I can cite the slapper worm. The slapper worm did infect a few Linux servers, and it did a similar pattern of trying to cause a buffer overrun. But it didn't get very far, simply because of the structure of Linux in the Apache server that it was running on. But you take IIS, at the time, especially with Code Red, it exploited the DCOM. This is not something that developers simply go out and do and say, well, hey, here's a hole. The point is the hole isn't supposed to exist in the first place. The remote procedure calls are the RPC or the DCOM object, and I've worked with it before. And many times, Windows leaves it open to listen to the network, and it's able to broadcast it to other applications that are already in the OS. What that does is it leaves it open to pervade, and it simply keeps going and going and going. Code Red was really unstoppable until it had its own stopping point. So Apache, being more popular, was able to successfully stop viruses coming in, whereas the IIS was not so fortunate. And that's really why Windows gets attacked more. It's simply easier. Windows, many times in its structure, not only leaving a lot of its ports open within the DCOM, and blatantly just listening to the network, Outlook. Many times when they were first starting that, allowing HTML to come in and automatically executing emails, boy, that just made it really easy for people to exploit. That is not something that millions of users go and find out and all that. That is a hole that should not exist, period. ActiveX, the exploit. Yeah, here's an address and a file, boom, and ActiveX says, I'll run it for you. I mean, that's a hole. you don't get those kinds of permissions and exploits within Unix standards. Now, not to say that that they can't be programmed in, but at least from the Unix OSs and OS 10 and the other distros that I've worked with, they simply aren't there. I mean, it's ridiculous on the history of Windows on what was it, on the holes that they've left open, and it's not anything that you can have fleets of people trying to investigate. The bottom line is that those holes should not exist because they are corrected later. The other issue that Windows has, and it was something that they could really have changed back around '97, is bringing in their or basically preserving natively their Win32 platform. The older one, coming from 95 on up, they preserve their backwards compatibility model, whereas OS 10 dropped its classic from OS 9 and simply, to satisfy those users, ran an emulator. But that actually stopped with the Intel Macs, as far as I know, and Leopard, I think, completely denies it. I can't remember, there was a date, but when Jobs came back, they basically said, well, OS 9 had its problems. I mean, the viruses, it was susceptible and very vulnerable, and they basically decided to make a cutoff point. Windows did have an opportunity to do so, but they continued to do backwards compatible native support, and that inherits problems. Now, granted, they fix those holes as they go on, but they create new ones when they do that. So that then leads me to Vista. Now, as far as I know, Vista does not have as large a market share as XP, but it is an attractive target, and that's primarily because Microsoft has boasted about its security. I believe they have several layers now, whether it's a worm, a virus, a Trojan, or whatnot, protecting Vista. So it's not going to be really attacked because it's popular. It's going to be attacked because it's a challenge, and I guarantee you those that get a kick off of writing viruses and these worms are going to do so. Pin another medal on their chest, what have you. I know that there have been quite a few proof of concepts that have gone through, which are just really exploratory worms and viruses, but it will be, I mean, that's pretty much understood, but don't think for a minute it's because it's the most popular. It's, for now, it's a new challenge, and one that Microsoft is standing behind. And I must say that the Vista, at least that I have, has held up fairly well. I know that my place of business that attacks, at least on Vista, have been really minimal in comparison to the XP machines. So, I mean, that's a positive, but we'll see how long Windows defenses hold up, and maybe they're able to have band-aided a lot of those problems that they had earlier within XP, but only the future will tell. Thanks for watching.